Chester. I'm a new trustee of the Norman Williams Public Library. And one of the discoveries I made was that I can actually recommend somebody to come and read here, and that'll happen. So anyway, but it was sort of simultaneous. We were out at a family lake in Wisconsin this summer, and we heard Peter Stark speak. And it turns out our two families have known each other forever, and we didn't even know he did all this incredible writing. And he gave an amazing talk. So we coerced him to come and visit, and we're very happy to have Peter and his wife Amy visiting from Missoula, Montana, and so we're glad they're here. But actually, Peter also did spend some time across the river at a college on the hill at Dartmouth, and he taught a seminar there yesterday, so he is familiar with this area. And but they live currently in Missoula, but they have also lived, I just found this out, with their children in Mozambique, Brazil, and Spain. They are quite the adventurers. And Peter, much of his writing prior to tackling history was adventure writing. He wrote a lot. He wrote for Outside Magazine, and it was sort of individual athletic or adventures that are pretty death-defying and things that you wouldn't really, I wouldn't do, and even my crazy husband wouldn't do, but he not only did it, but he wrote about it, and including Olympic ski jumping, going down the Olympic level luge, and then there was the famous kayaking trip down an unexplored river in Africa, where he avoided the hippos and the crocodiles, but in a Jeep, a black mamba snake attacked the Jeep. But he missed that one by a fraction of a hair. So after that, from what I understand, there was perhaps a family discussion, and Peter stayed a little bit more in the US, because they did have two children at that point. And he started writing his, was it your first book, was Last Breath?
Right.
Okay, which has a cheerful topic. It is about the many ways you can die in the wilderness. And there's some pretty gruesome ones. His blog was, his first blog was called When Your Teeth Fall Out.
And the teeth fall out of your head.
Yeah, which again, terribly cheerful. And then he explored 4 of the most remote, wild, unpopulated areas of the United States where there's no light pollution or human pollution, I guess. And he wrote a book called The Last Empty Places, which is pretty interesting as well. And I'm thinking that during that time, when he was exploring the country, the US was when you were inspired to write Astoria.
Right.
Okay. And Astoria is the story of John Jacob Astor's hope to create a settlement in the Pacific Northwest that would actually be a basis for a global trading system based on furs. So that's a great read, and we have that book here today, and we even have a testimonial from Mike O'Cullen saying what a wonderful book it is. And then came Young Washington, which is such a great book about Washington in his 20s, which is a time frame for Washington that I certainly never studied in American history or knew anything about. And it's pretty interesting because it was kind of his warm-up. Thank heavens he had a little practice, because he really did a bad job before he joined the revolution. But I won't let Peter tell you that. And Peter is an amazing storyteller, and we had him for dinner with a few friends, and I don't think any of us will get over it. It was just such a great experience. So I'm really happy to share our friend with you tonight. And thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you, Lori, for that great introduction. There's nothing left to say, so I don't know what I don't know what more I can tell you. And I really want to thank Lori and John Chester, who have been great hosts for us here. And we're staying in their nice little guest house down the road. And I threatened that they're going to have to pry us out of here, because we might just stay permanently. And it's really a wonderful community, and Amy's never been here before, and so she's been having a great time exploring. And I've never been in this library before, which is spectacular. So I'm just stunning. And I'm so pleased to be here. And thanks to Danelle and everybody else for putting this together, and the Friends of the Library, and Public Access TV for being here too. So I'm going to put on my glasses for this. Well, where do I start? Let's do it this way. At the risk of speaking blasphemy about our founding father, let me start with a brief passage from the beginning of this book. It's about George Washington when he was 21 years old. And this is not the statuesque George Washington we know. This is a whole different George Washington. And nor is it the Washington of the cherry tree bedtime story, which is a complete fable invented by the Reverend Weems about 1800 as a moral instruction for our nation's youth at that time. This young Washington is ambitious, temperamental, vain, thin-skinned, petulant, awkward, demanding, stubborn, annoying, hasty, and passionate. This Washington has not yet learned to cultivate his image or contain his emotions. Here, instead, is a raw young man struggling toward maturity and in love with a close friend's wife. This is the Washington of emotional neediness, personal ambition, and mistakes, many mistakes. So we do have this image of Washington as this sort of flawless individual who is kind of like immaculately conceived and stepped on the stage fully formed out of the ether as a sort of man god to lead our nation to its birth in its first few years. But as I think many of us know, many of you know, is that Washington didn't become commander-in-chief of the Continental Army until age 43. And before that, he had a very different career. Basically, before he was a great leader, he was not a great leader. That he had a long and difficult learning curve. He failed. He made many mistakes. But he learned from his mistakes, and that's really where I find George Washington truly inspirational, is the way he learned from his mistakes. That it brings out a more, this younger version, the struggling George Washington, brings out in a way a more instructive and inspiring and vulnerable, and in a way a more human and accessible George Washington, compared to the sort of remote statue that we have, the one that's up there on Mount Rushmore and the 555-foot tall Washington Monument. So this book, Young Washington, focuses on George Washington's early years, mostly between the time he's age 21 and 25. So 5 years of his life. And it wasn't so long ago, after I completed this book, that I realized I'd spent 4 years researching and writing it, and he'd spent 5 years living that period. So we were on an almost par in terms of time invested. But before I started my research, I didn't know any more about George Washington, about this phase of this part of George Washington, than anybody else, than most Americans. I'm not a presidential biographer. I come at this from the wilderness and adventure side, as Lori was saying. And she mentioned this book called Last Empty Places. So I was researching that book. This was at least 12 years ago. And I was looking literally at the blank spots on the map, the lightless areas, looking at a high-resolution satellite photo of the U.S. at night, and going in on the areas that were the darkest and the largest. And 4 of those, and 2 in the east and 2 in the west. And in the east, one of them I chose, well, actually, you're probably curious which ones, because you're not so far away. One was northern Maine, along the St. John River, if you've ever been up there, very remote and wild. And the other was Western Pennsylvania. And if you've ever been to Western Pennsylvania, you know it's really mountainous, it's really rugged, it's really forested, it's really wild, and it's very thinly populated. So as I was out there wandering around in Western Pennsylvania doing research for this book, I kept stumbling across the story of a young George Washington. And it was not the George Washington I knew at all. This George Washington was getting into a whole lot of trouble, and he was also getting a lot of other people in a whole lot of trouble. So, you know, I've always been fascinated by how humans respond in situations of extreme situations in the wilderness. And as an adventure writer, I've written about that a lot over some decades, and I've experienced some of those situations myself. For instance, that African river trip, and yeah, I found it really interesting how George Washington had been through situations like that in the wilderness, in really pretty extreme situations. He went through some extraordinary things, and I feel that we didn't really know much about that part of his life, and I wanted to understand how those experiences might have affected him, and also how they might have transformed him from this kind of a mess of a young man into the great leader he would one day become, or send him in that direction. So that's essentially what this book is about, those years when he's thrashing around in the wilderness in the French and Indian War. And what I'll do is I'll read about 3 short passages, and I'll give you some context in before each of those passages, and then we can have a question and answer afterward, or discussion, or please throw out any comments of your own, or we can all go home, whatever you want to do. It's when the Arctic snowstorm sweeps in, we can take off. So we don't think of George Washington as very ambitious, but he was a really ambitious guy. And it really becomes clear in his mid-teens how very ambitious he is. In the book, I have about almost a half a chapter on his early, essentially his ancestry, starting in England in 1500. And I think there's some fascinating stories in it. And I won't go into it other than to say that the Washingtons always seemed to be aspiring to the upper aristocracy, and with remarkable consistency not quite making it, because they'd marry wealthy landed widows and rise, and then they'd have like 18 kids, and that would disperse the wealth, and they'd have to kind of start all over again. So that was sort of their pattern. And George's great-great-grandfather came to this continent from England in the mid-1600s on a trading voyage, and essentially got shipwrecked in Virginia. And he had a share of a cargo of a trading ship, and lost a lot of that cargo, and got into a lot of trouble, and got in a lawsuit, and he ended up marrying the judge's daughter in the lawsuit, and she had a lot of land. So that established the Washingtons in the New World. You know, they kept up the tradition going. And so that was Virginia in the mid-1600s. So for the next several generations, they were plantation owners, tobacco growers, slave holders, but they were always sort of a middling level in that whole Virginia plantation world. They weren't one of these members of they didn't have one of those great plantations with the beautiful houses and the hallways with marble floors to hold balls, and the thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. They weren't that. They were a little more middling. So when George was 11, his father, Gus, died. And Gus left most of his plantation lands to George's older half-brothers. meaning George had very little land. He was given very little land. He was not given enough land to actually start his own plantation. So George needed a way to make a living. And I've often thought that if Gus had not died at when George was so young, and if George's older half-brother, Lawrence, whom George really revered, had not died when Lawrence was quite young, and if George had a better relationship with his mother, Mary, they had a very strained relationship, I've really thought that he'd have a much more anchored and sure place in the world, thought of himself much in a much more secure spot as a young man. He didn't have that. He didn't have a formal education. His older half-brothers, as many of the sons of the big Virginia plantation owners, had been sent off to boarding school in England, and so they had a formal British education. George's father died before he had that, so he had more or less an 8th grade education, and that was a problem for him. So at age 14, he took up his father's old surveying instruments and he taught himself to survey. And that was another thing that would mark George Washington throughout his life, this real ability to focus, teach himself, self-taught, and very determined about it. And it's in a way to compensate for his lack of a formal education. So his older half-brother, Lawrence, who at that point was still alive, had married into the aristocratic Fairfax family. And we all know Fairfax, Virginia, and there's Fairfax County, and it's a huge name in Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, the Fairfaxes were true British peers, and about a century earlier, the Crown had given them 5 million acres of Virginia land. And we think, well, here you think of where you have like 140-acre farms and half-acre lawns if you live in town. Well, 5 million acres is a farm or a forest or a lawn 90 miles by 90 miles. So it was a huge chunk of territory, and the Fairfaxes were beginning to sell some of that off, especially towards the mountains, towards the beginning, the Blue Ridge and the first rises of the Appalachians. And they sent a surveying party out in that frontier area in 1748 when George was 16, and they invited George to go along on the surveying party. And there were professional surveyor, professional more or less surveyors along, and there were a couple of frontier guys who were helping out. And then there were they called them the 2 young gentlemen. There was young George William Fairfax, who was about, I think, 19 or 20 at the time, and young George Washington, who was 16 at the time. So the two gentlemen were, they hadn't been in this world before, and for the young George Washington, he was really, taken aback by the crudeness of life among the frontier settlers. That he complained about bed bugs in the blankets. He complained about smoke in the tent. He complained about the settlers who, shockingly, would eat on a table that was not covered with a linen tablecloth. And they were also eating with their fingers and a big knife, which was just wild. His party met a party of Indians who performed a dance one night, and he called the Indians most comical. This is in his journal from that time, and he said that in his journal he said, well, the settlers were as ignorant a people as the Indians. So this was not a very generous George Washington. But there was clearly something about the wilderness, the frontier. He wasn't really deep in the wilderness, he was more on the frontier. There was clearly something about that life on the frontier and the wilderness edge that really appealed to him and that he found gratifying. So that's what this passage is about, is that that first surveying trip when he's 16 years old and tasting this for the first time. And this is, I don't know if you know the terrain down there, the Virginia terrain. This is just over the Blue Ridge Mountains in the Shenandoah Valley, which was just beginning to be settled then. Away from the few small settlements and inns, the outdoor life had its own compensations. There was an excitement to it, an adrenaline edge, a raw sense of having to fend for yourself. You could take satisfaction in simple things, learning how to build a fire in deep woods, how to cook simple food in a single pot or with a handheld spit over an open flame, how to erect a tent in cold rain, how to attain a body position best suited to sleep on hard ground, wrapped in bearskin or blanket. Unlike the Tidewater region, with its clean sheets and bountiful tables provided by liveried servants and field slaves, one constantly had to tend to one's own most basic human needs: food, shelter, warmth, while traversing landscapes that could transform from benign and embracing to hostile and forbidding, depending on terrain and weather, from clambering over rotted logs and crawling through underbrush and blustering sleet, to strolling through grassy meadows under fleecy white clouds drifting past in a blue sky. Social status did not matter. You had to figure it out, work together, acquire confidence and self-sufficiency, sharply engage in the here and the now. You had to pay attention in the wilds to stay alive. So by the age of 18, George is making a decent living as a surveyor. And he's actually starting to buy his first own lands at the age of 18 in the Shenandoah Valley. But he's still ambitious to climb in the Virginia aristocracy. And so he takes a part-time job with the Virginia military. It was sort of like our National Guard, an officer's job. And then he volunteers for a mission to the governor of Virginia, the British governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie. And Governor Dinwiddie needs someone to take a message over the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, deep hundreds of miles back into the Ohio wilderness, and deliver it to a French commandant back there. And basically the message says, stay out, all these lands belong to King George. And so I won't go into all the details about the tensions between France and Britain. Well, of course, there's 700 years of tensions back, or battle, of fighting back in Europe, and they're having a few years of peace at this moment. This is early 1750s, and the British colonies are on the coast. This is 20 years or more before the Revolution, so it's all British colonies, and then up in Canada are the French colonies, actually established a little bit earlier. And then in between the two is this huge area they call it the Ohio. And we know the state of Ohio, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the whole Ohio Valley, the whole drainage. So it's Ohio, it's a lot of Pennsylvania, it's part of Virginia, it's Illinois, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, on and on and on. Huge area, almost the size of France. So Virginia claims that area. And because Virginia says its boundaries extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Actually, they call it extend all the way to the island of California. They're not sure what's out there, but they just say our boundaries go west as far as you can go. And it goes through the Ohio Valley. Those are the Virginia boundaries. And the French have been using the Ohio Valley and its rivers for decades as fur trade routes and trading with the Indians there. So George leaves Virginia, the plantation country, in October of 1753. He has a wilderness guide, Christopher Gist, who really knows what he's doing. They have a few servants handling the horses, and they start over the Appalachian Mountains, and they just get hammered by winter snowstorms. George has never seen anything like this before. It's very uncomfortable camping in snow. If you've ever done it, you understand that. This is not the gentle coast, the Tidewater country. And they travel hundreds of miles back there. They get to a French post back there, and there's a French officer, a younger guy, who greets them, and George says, I have this letter from the British governor, and the guy says, the French officer says, oh man, you came to the wrong place. You got to talk to my boss, and he's like a week's ride that way. So George and his guys get back on the horses, and they ride a week through, through sleet and rain and ice and on and on. get to a larger French fort, and they're greeted by this distinguished, older French gentleman who's a professional officer and very, very distinguished. And he gives them the whole formal reception with dinner, with the best meats and candlelight. Of course, there's no other light, but wines, French wines brought in from Montreal by canoe. And then he takes the message from Governor Dinwiddie and he takes it in the back room and he reads it. A while later, he comes out and gives George an envelope with his answer. And then eventually George rides off, and as Governor Dinwiddie has said, use all possible haste to get back to me. And so George is in a huge hurry to perform this mission and really establish himself as a up-and-coming hero. And he ends up having all these misadventures on the way back, that it's so cold and icy and snowy that the horses can't get forage, and they can't get water from the frozen stream. So George says, well, let's just leave the horses. And the wilderness guide, Christopher Gist, says, have you actually ever walked before? And of course, George hasn't. He's a Virginia gentleman. He's a very good rider, but he's not a walker. And they take off through the forest, and then George says, well, let's skip all these windy Indian paths and take a shortcut, and let's just go through the woods rather than on the path. And Gist says, that's not such a great idea, but he gives in to George, and off they go. And they end up running. They end up thinking they're being chased by Indians, and they run 40 hours straight through the woods. It's snowy night, snowy day, and they finally end up at the bank of a big river, and we know it today as the Allegheny. And because it's so cold, this is right around it's late December of 1753. It's so cold that they think the river's going to be frozen, but it's not. It's frozen along the edges, but in the center it's open with these big ice floes running down. So Christopher Gist says, okay, our only hope is to build a raft. And of course, thanks to George's bright idea of leaving the horses behind, they've left all the best equipment behind, the heavy stuff, so they only have this one little hatchet. And they have to spend all day building a raft, and they finally get the raft built, and that's where this passage starts. I'm going to lower this a little bit so I can see. Speak up if you can't hear me. After laboring on the raft the entire day, they finished just after sunset. They slung their backpacks on board and slid it off the ice shelf and into the river. They jumped on board, grabbing the setting poles they had crafted, long wooden poles with which, standing on the raft, they could push against the bottom of the river, propelling the crude raft forward through the water. They pushed out into the broad Allegheny in the twilight. The sudden power of the current seized the raft, jerking it downstream. Thick floes of ice swirling in the river pressed around them. The raft wedged between moving floes. It jostled and bumped, its logs driven underwater by the force of the current and floating ice, threatening to capsize. We expected every moment our raft to sink and ourselves to perish, Washington recorded in his journal. Determined to save himself and Gist and the important mission, Washington shoved his pole to the river bottom and leaned on it with all his powerful 6-foot-plus frame to steady the raft. The youthful strength and fine horsemanship that had distinguished him in the Virginia plantation country meant nothing here. The river's powerful current shoved the raft into the pole while Washington clung to it, suddenly snapping the pole forward like the arm of a catapult. The force flung young Washington into deep, swirling water. He surely emitted a reflexive gasp as he immersed in a splash among the ice floes, arms reaching out. The human body can survive only a few minutes in water just above the freezing point before succumbing to hypothermia, dangerously low body temperatures. One reflexively hyperventilates, and the heart rate jumps as the frigid water chills sensors buried deep in the skin. The body preserves its vital functions by closing capillaries in fingers and limbs, sending blood to the core to warm heart, brain, and lungs. Fingers quickly stiffen, then arms and legs, responding only clumsily to commands. Thinking becomes confused as core temperature drops below 95 degrees and brain enzymes slow. At a core temperature of 86 degrees, the hypothermia victim in frigid water becomes unconscious and drowns. Or, long before then, the current could sweep him downstream, pulling him beneath the flows, trapping him underwater, bumping along under the grinding ice, trying to surface for air, head hitting the underside of the flows, frantically seeking an opening until finally his breath expires. This is where I like to say, you got to read the book to find out what happens. So what happens? I'll give it away, or partly away. George manages to pull himself up on the raft, and he and Gist get the raft to an island out in the middle of the river, but they're still not saved because it's really this frigid night, and George is soaking wet, and he's no doubt, I mean, just, really on the edge of losing it. And they have to start a fire, and Gist manages to get a fire going for them. But Gist freezes all his fingers and toes in starting a fire to warm George. And that it was another example of George, in essence, underestimating the power of the wilderness and overestimating his own power. So George eventually gets the message back to Governor Dinwiddie at the governor's palace in Williamsburg, now Colonial Williamsburg, and the governor's palace is actually still there. And gives it to Governor Dinwiddie, and Governor Dinwiddie, the 60-year-old jowly Scottish merchant with the big belly and the brass buttons and the white wig and the whole thing, opens the message, and what it says from the elderly, distinguished French commandant, it says very politely, in formal language, our two empires have been at war for a very long time, and now they are at peace. And I would like to maintain that peace. But as to your request that I leave the Ohio wilderness, I don't think so. So, of course, this enrages Dinwiddie, and Washington's all up in arms. And Dinwiddie sends Washington back into the wilderness at the head of a small military party. And his job is to deliver a kind of a firmer message to the French commandant. And Dinwiddie also warns him, don't be the aggressor and be cautious. And Washington does exactly the opposite. And he ends up hearing that there's a French party way back in the wilderness, and he becomes convinced this French party is going to attack him, and instead he attacks them first, but they turn out to be a diplomatic party having breakfast as his guys come over the edge of a wooded canyon, the top of a canyon, and look down and see this French party, and Washington gives the orders and they open fire, but these guys are having breakfast down there. So there are all these wounded French guys and dead down in the canyon, the little glen, and their French officer, Ensign Jumonville, is lying there wounded and trying to deliver this message, diplomatic message to George's party. But meanwhile, one of the Indian guides with George goes up behind the Half-King, and he takes his tomahawk and he slams it down on the Half-King's skull, pulls open his skull, pulls out his brains, washes his brains through his fingers, and then the rest of the Indians with George scalp the remaining dead and the survivors and chop off one guy's head and put it on a pole. And then George is like, what's going on here? This is like way out of his control. So he takes all these, meaning like 25 or 30 French soldiers prisoner. And at this point, you'd think, a prudent commander would consult with his higher up about, where do we go from here? Well, not George, who's so eager to make a name for himself, that instead he writes his younger brother. Well, I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there's something charming in the sound. So there's this cockiness that George has, and he writes to Governor Dinwiddie, if the French put up no more resistance than this, we'll drive them back to damn Montreal. And George, tries to do that. He marches ahead. It doesn't work out that way. The French are very angry about their in Saint-Jumonville. They unleash a force of hundreds of French warriors and many, many hundreds of French soldiers and many, many hundreds of Indian warriors who end up basically slaughtering George's men. So it's this awful bloody scene. It's called Fort Necessity, the Battle of Fort Necessity. And George's guys are dying in these muddy, bloody trenches in the rain and in the night. And finally, George ends up surrendering the fort. And this, and he also signs a document in the rain and the dark in French that admits that he's an assassin and a murderer. This is our George Washington. And these essentially are the events that set off the French and Indian War. You can imagine when this news gets back to London and Paris about what happened, it doesn't go over well, and everything just erupts. So George, amazingly, given his mishaps, his missteps, mistakes, manages to stay on as an officer in the Virginia military. And Governor Dinwiddie eventually appoints him to be in charge of the Virginia Regiment. And his job is to protect the frontier against the Virginia settlers along the frontier against Indian raiders who are allied with the French from coming and killing the frontier settlers. And it's basically an impossible task for George. It's a 350-mile long frontier in the mountains. I compare it to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, very rugged with a lot of indigenous warriors who know their way around. And so it's an impossible task. But George at first seems most focused on his own self and well-being. That seems to be what really drives him into a passion. He's focused on his reputation, his personal pride. He's jealous towards other officers who are ranked higher than he is. He quits, or he threatens to quit, at least 7 times during this period. And he's this very petulant guy. And he finally, he's upset that he's not ranked above a Captain Dagworthy, who's an officer in the British Army. And George is a colonel in the Virginia militia. Technically, I mean, his rank, all things being equal, would be higher than Captain Dagworthy's, but Captain Dagworthy has his commission from the king, and George has it from the governor of Virginia, so George is underneath Captain Dagworthy. It drives George nuts. He takes a journey all the way to Boston in winter on horseback, a journey of 1,000 miles round trip, to petition the governor Shirley to rank him above Captain Dagworthy. And George has all sorts of, exotic experiences going up there. He stops in Manhattan and takes some very eligible young ladies out on the town, to the equivalent of a Broadway show. There are no Broadway shows, of course, in the 1750s. There is a Broadway, but he takes them to this show called a microcosm, or world in miniature, which is like a model of a Roman temple with all these gears and cranks, and you turn the cranks, and there are musicians who play music and dancers who dance and gods who come and go, and it's this like wonder, this marvel of the beginning of the mechanical age, which is just beginning to dawn. And George has taken young Polly Phillips, who's the heiress to 53,000 acres of Hudson Valley land, to see this thing, not once, but twice. And there is, it's very clear, starting in this phase of his life, that George has a real weakness for land, and he has a real weakness for the ladies, and he has a special weakness for ladies with land, which would be Polly Phillips. And but no spark is struck. He goes on. He rides on to Boston. and he buys a bunch of French silver lace. He's really into designing uniforms and into spangles and everything else. He really likes finery. He buys a bunch of silver lace. He eventually sees Governor Shirley, who's kept him waiting, kept him cooling his heels, and Governor Shirley says, okay, yeah, if you guys are both in the same place, yeah, okay, you rank above Captain Dagworthy, we're done with that. So George rides the 500 miles back to the Virginia frontier, and when he gets back, he's been gone for, I think, almost 2 months, but just disaster is erupting on the Virginia frontier that in his absence, frontier settlers are just being slaughtered by Indian raiders. So he has to decide, where is he going to keep his men? All concentrated in Winchester, where he has his fort in the Shenandoah Valley, or scattered on these little forts up and down the frontier. And this is, in my mind, a really significant moment in George Washington's life, because at this moment, when these frontier settlers are really under attack, and he's in a very difficult position, instead of just, kind of brazenly making a decision on his own, he pauses and he sits down with all his officers around a table, and all his subordinate officers, every one, and he consults each one and asks each one very carefully, what do you think we should do? And he listens, and he doesn't give any sense of what he thinks they should do, but he listens to everyone very carefully. And then he thinks about it for a while, and he deliberates, and he makes his decision. And this has ended up being this method, this technique that George Washington would employ from that point forward in his life, all the way, when he's the commander of the Continental Army, when he becomes president, and it serves him very well. He's really noted for doing that, to really listening to his advisors. But it starts right here in this moment. And in this case, the officers tell him, well, we think you should keep the men here, keep everybody here in Winchester. So I'll just read a little bit at the end of this. So things only got worse along the frontier. Panic spread. The residents of Winchester anticipated a full-scale attack at any moment. Townspeople, assisted by soldiers at Washington's orders, chopped down trees and bushes near the town's main street to prevent Indian ambushers from hiding. Still, the frontier deteriorated. After 2.5 years of hard work, high danger, and political maneuvering, he had attained clear command of the Virginia regiment. But within a mere 2 weeks of achieving this, he found himself in an impossible situation, hopelessly under-equipped against an unseen foe, surrounded by mass panic, and awash in a bloody and gruesome reign of terror. Scalped bodies lay outside burning farmhouses, the corpses stuck full of arrows, the men's brains beaten out with their own rifle barrels, the barrels left sticking out of the hollow skulls, the farmstead's axes and scythes embedded in the mutilated torsos. In these moments of crisis, surrounded by pleading frontier families, settlers begging him, George Washington, to protect them, Washington began to move beyond his self-absorption and obsession with rank and reputation. In his empathy for the people suffering, he made a first step toward the selflessness and sacrifice for which he would one day become famous. So I think I might end it there. I'll give you a little bit of an afterword to that. That what he finally becomes really sick, and in this period he has the bloody flux, which is dysentery, and he's wrestled with it for several years in this wilderness period, but it really flares up. And it flares up just at the time he is so frustrated, and that the men he has are deserting in great quantities, and he decides to make an example of some of them. And so he builds a gallows 40 feet high. And he, in 40 feet high, that's higher than any building in Winchester at the time. It's higher than the fort. It's probably higher than the flagpole. And he hangs these guys. And I've really wondered how that felt as a 25-year-old. And does he feel any self-doubt that he has this power in his hands to condemn to death these deserters? One of whom he grew up in the same county with, that he probably knew from childhood. And as these guys are pulled up, I just think that he surely felt older and more weighted, as the crowds dispersed and the rope, did its job. And I kind of think something was strangled inside George Washington in that moment too. And then shortly after that, he becomes very ill, and he finally quits. And I'll read you this last passage. He writes to, he quits and he goes back to Mount Vernon, which he now owns. He now owns. He bought it from his older brother's widow. And he writes to an older British officer in Pennsylvania, a very distinguished guy, John Stanwix, who's kind of a confessor to this young Washington. So here's his letter as he quits. My constitution, I believe, has received great injury, and as nothing can retrieve it but the greatest care and most circumspect conduct, as I now see no prospect of a preferment in a military life, meaning the British Royal Army won't make me an officer, which he's been trying to do for years, and he sees no chance of that happening. As I now see no prospect of a preferment in a military life, and as I despair of rendering that immediate service which this colony may require of the person commanding their troops, I have some thoughts of quitting my command and retiring from all public business, leaving my post to be filled by others more capable of the task, and who may perhaps have their endeavors crowned with better success than my own has been. After 4 years in the wilderness on the frontier, this is my commentary, after helping to spark the French and Indian War and surviving Braddock's defeat, and countless hours trying to build, train, and discipline the Virginia Regiment and protect frontier settlers, it sounded like he was finished and ready to retire to Mount Vernon. It sounded like the farewell address of George Washington, age 26. Already, he had lived a lot. So I'll leave it right there. So thanks so much. And we can have questions or comments, or we can all go make a snowman.
Can you tell me who was recording all of this?
Many people. There are hundreds and hundreds of letters that Washington himself wrote, and many that others around him wrote, Governor Dinwiddie, and on and on. And these are all been cataloged and transcribed by the University of Virginia, and very carefully annotated with all the background. And they're available. They're at the Library of Congress. It's a wonderful resource. They're online. We can call those up right here on our cell phone. Anyone, letter from April 2nd, 1753, can call it right up. So, and they're journals, and they're all sorts of other documentation. But this bit and that bit and that bit.
My question, and I hope this isn't a dim-witted question to ask.
No worries.
So I'm such a person of this era. When you said, well, first of all, when you're describing the group's journeying, to get to different places and how long it took them. 500 miles by horse
Right.
to Boston, and how long did that take him?
Yeah, it takes him. I have to remember. I think it's about 2 weeks. It's about 2 weeks to get to at least 2 weeks to get to Boston. 500 miles each way by horse.
And then the other thing that struck me was when you were talking about how, so sort of the sparking of the French and Indian War, right? And you said when that news gets back to Paris and London, and I thought, so how did that news? Was it by people going on a boat and telling them?
So yeah, I'll paraphrase the question. And it's a really interesting topic and a good question. Essentially, it's about communications in that era,
Right.
and how unbelievably slow they are compared to our era. And so, for George to ride to get from Virginia up to Boston was about, I think, 2 weeks at least, I think. And then to get from the news of this battle at Fort Necessity that really sparked the French and Indian War, for that to get back to London and Paris, that would probably take about 6 weeks. It would go on the first ship that was headed overseas, the first British ship that was heading back to England, and then it would be widely disseminated, to the authorities. And so, I would guess to get a message to London and back would be on the order of, at best 2 months and more like 3 months. And so you can see how to command what's going on here from Parliament, from London, would be really difficult, and events are unfolding so fast here, which is a lot of what happens.
Thank you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression in the beginning of your talk that you were in the mountains of western Pennsylvania when you were inspired to write this book. Now, were there oral stories about Washington there?
Oh, yeah, that's another interesting question. The question is that I was in western Pennsylvania when I first really heard the stories about young George Washington, and was there an oral tradition about young George Washington? And I suspect there is a little bit of one. It wasn't very prevalent when I was there. When I asked people about it, some would know. I learned about this story mostly from reading the history of that area, and the early history of that area, he's very prominently mentioned. And people who really know their history would know the story. But I don't remember any kind of wide dissemination of that. But I should correct myself. There's some wonderful memorials, institutions, museums. There's a national, what do we call it? A national battlefield run by the National Park Service called Fort Necessity, and that explains all this in great detail, and it's really interesting. There's a reconstruction of the fort on the actual place. It's this flimsy little fort, like 50 feet in diameter, a circle of posts, basically. So there are things like that, and there's some great museums in Pittsburgh and great institutions that have recorded this history.
Visited Trenton Barracks in New Jersey once, before Washington crossed the Delaware, and he said that he was the first one. He had his troops vaccinated, which was a very unusual thing at the time. He had smallpox. Did he learn something as a young man?
I really know these years of his life. So when he gets to Trenton, that gets beyond the edge of my universe somewhat. But the smallpox is really interesting because he did get it as a young man, and it's that his older brother, older half brother Lawrence, had been also a military officer in the Virginia military, and then had sailed with the Royal Navy on this expedition to South America, and so the older brother kind of knew that whole British Navy, that whole hierarchy, and the older brother Lawrence got tuberculosis badly, and he was really starting to fail, and so he went to Barbados, in the Caribbean, as a recovery, as a health measure, and he took George with him, and George was 21. It was just before he volunteered for this job, and in Barbados, he got smallpox. And he was mostly laid up in Barbados, but he survived. And they were there for some weeks, and I think he was out of it for maybe 2 weeks. But he did survive, and that left two legacies in my mind. Is that that was the only time George went abroad in his whole life, the only time he crossed the ocean. And he was a land-based guy, and even though his mom. He wanted to go to sea when he was 14, but his mom wouldn't let him. And he became a surveyor instead. But George, on that trip, because his brother was connected with the British Royal Navy, that George and his brother were invited to all these parties of all the, like the governor of Barbados and the admiral of this and on and on and on, all these high British Empire officials. And George, I think, for the first time saw a world outside his own little Virginia world. And I think he found it very appealing in some way. And that his whole career in this period very much wanted to be a British royal officer. And that's why he went on this 1,000-mile journey to become, either be named a British royal officer or to be ranked above one. And he saw this other life, this royal officer's life, and he couldn't get there. And that was a huge source of frustration, and I think ultimate resentment, and I think he carried that into his later life. That came to fruition many years later as the revolution started unfolding. And likewise, the smallpox, that he was familiar with the disease. And at that time, it was just about that time that a vaccination was being experimented with. And I think maybe it started in Europe. And I know Thomas Jefferson was very much into the smallpox vaccination. But you're right, that George had all his men at some point, or many of his men, vaccinated with the smallpox vaccination.
So when he sat down and listened to everybody, how did Mr. Brash get to that point? What do you think were the sort of moments that made him think, I need to sit down and actually listen to people and be more considered in my actions?
One, to me, very significant moment when that happened was, so after I'll repeat the question. How did young brash George Washington finally decide to pause and consult his men rather than charging forward the way he had at the beginning? And so at the beginning, that first, when he attacked the breakfasting French guys, he was all cocky and, I heard bullets whistle, blah, blah, blah. And then he keeps going forward, and then he hears that there are all these French coming after him and Indians. And so he goes back to this, flim-flam little Fort Necessity, and his guys get slaughtered. And, it's just this awful scene in the mud and the blood. And, there are descriptions of this by survivors, and that the trenches are filling up with blood and rainwater, and these guys are just lying in it. And these are these young men who are George's same age, some of them even older, and whom he knows and whom he's been working with for a long time, and they're dying all around him. And basically he got them into this situation for being so kind of brash. And I think that's one of the real moments that he says he starts developing this empathy for his officers, I think. For his men and his officers. And I think that's a key moment. And so as things go on over the next months, he's much more cautious about consulting them, bringing them into the process, essentially, making them own it too. There are 7 or 8 moments that that really jump out in my mind as times when he started making this transition. And one was just what we were talking about in the trenches of Fort Necessity, and another was hanging these guys because he got really sick right after it. And as I was reading, he just said, I'm done with public life. And I think he was so stressed out. And so those are 2, and there are, I wish I could throw out a couple of more right now. But anyway, there are moments like that in the arc when the frontier settlers are begging him to help them. That's a really key moment. And he's almost frantic. He writes some letters that are almost frantic in tone, saying, I'd give my own life if I could help these people, but there's nothing I can do. Okay.
Is there
Yeah, well, thank you. You've been a great audience. Great question. Thanks.